I'm gonna start. I'm going to start with a complaint, and my complaint is that every time Dougal used the phrase epistemological rupture, I felt profoundly physically uncomfortable, as if you're describing a particular medical condition, which maybe you were. One of the great thing and the curse about speaking second in events like this is there's absolutely no point preparing too much in advance, because you can guarantee that 2/3 of your material will be absorbed by earlier speaker or speakers. And the good thing about it is you can kind of gives you license to busk a bit. So NEF, New Economics Foundation, works on many of the issues that Dougal was talking about. So I'm going to weave a few things around them in, but I'm going to make a couple of other various observations as well. I was really interested when we were having the sort of introductory remarks earlier that I'm kind of outside academia. I have some of my best friends are academics. I have nothing against academics, but I'm personally outside academia. So I find it fascinating to hear these little kind of throwaway remarks about how there's a clash between having impact and just being free to have ideas. I find this extraordinary. I find it a most extraordinary observation because, apart from anything else, how can you ever really know the depth and the veracity and the colour and the texture of an idea until you've actually tried to do something with it? How can you know until you've truly done? I suppose working in a think tank, people think that all you do is kind of sit around and think, and of course not, because you're more or less like a consultancy and you have to kind of constantly show impact and report on things. But our own little debate is between people who bang on about theories of change, which I'm actually not that interested in. So I'm interested in the practice of change, because it's through trying to do things that you really learn and that useful ideas emerge. And I use useful in a very, very broad sense. Just a couple of quick observations on some of the things that came up when Dougal was speaking. I mean, it's absolutely central to the debate between sort of the new economics and the old economics is this over-privileging of certain very reductive notions about human nature that are built into the assumptions of general equilibrium theory about competitive individualism. And yet, for every misappropriation of Darwin's ideas about so-called survival of the fittest most best adapted for survival, of course, it always meant was a Kropotkin talking about mutual aid and about the importance of collaboration, co-evolution, cooperation. I'll say a little bit more about the growth issue, because that's a big one as we go on. And when we start talking, and in lots of different ways, I think Dougal was talking about this, is about what are the things, the big things, which exist outside the formal moneyed economy. The language we use to talk about that, and it's a language which has evolved through economists like Neva Goodwin and Edgar Kahn, the guy who developed the time bank concept, is this idea of the core economy. The core economy is basically you and me and our neighbours and our families and the way that we work as communities and societies to basically hold the whole thing together, on top of which the froth of economic life, investment and finance and markets and all that crap sits, unregarding the foundations upon which it depends. And when you do these kind of slightly playful exercises to say, well, if we did want to put a value on all the things which are not counted and we take for granted, like potty training children, the question has been raised, how much would it cost the FTSE 100 if it had to pay to potty train its senior executives? It doesn't have to do that, because it takes for granted the fact that society, unpaid, has already done it for you. Other questions, how much would it cost if you had to pay to pollinate all the crops that we take it for granted that bees will do for us? Well, you can play these games and you come up with sums of tens and hundreds of billions of pounds or dollars. But the point is, you couldn't afford it if you had to pay for it, and it would be practically and physically impossible anyway. If you can imagine legions of people walking over the great plains of America individually pollinating or trying to every flower. So there's a point at which the unregarded real economy of people and human relationships and social interaction and ecological services, makes a mockery of the fact that 99.9% of what is taught and discussed in the media about economics sits on this invisible foundation upon which it is the froth, like the foam on the top of a really good cup of coffee. I should also say at the outset, because one can only ever make a few observations on occasions like this, that if you want to follow up some of our thinking about how we think through and reconcile issues of scarcity and the acknowledgement of these other real economic factors, and how we imagine ourselves the other side of this both epistemological and resource rupture, we put all our work at the New Economics Foundation now under a program which we're calling the Great Transition. There's lots of individual reports about it, but there's a background one which is a free download off the website called The Great Transition. And in it we throw up our thinking about how to conceptualize many of these problems, but also one or two of the outstanding issues. The other thing, I think it's absolutely fine for us to think out loud about these things a little bit and be honest that we don't know, and neither should we think we should be able to know exactly what it's going to look like, the other side of the rupture, because there will be immense emergent results and consequences and unpredictable outcomes. And we shouldn't feel bad about that either, because a couple of months ago, Shell, one of the world's largest companies, produced a report called Signals and Signposts, which was a condensation of everything that they, as one of the most powerful economic players on the planet, understood about what's going to happen between now and the year 2050. And what they understood could be summarized in this lovely little diagram, which is on about page 6 of their report. It's this strange symbol that, I don't know if you can see it there, this question mark. They haven't got a bloody clue. And they talk about this zone between now and 2050, and they call it zone of uncertainty. That's a great way of getting off the hook, isn't it? And then they refine it a little bit, and they come to the conclusion that it's actually a zone of either extraordinary opportunity or misery. I had the dishonourable thought in my mind that, given the way that they've behaved in large parts of the Niger Delta, they seem to be able to combine opportunity with misery quite well. Cheap shot, isn't it? But hey, they're big. They can take it. As you can see, this is a large amount of preamble here. So much preamble that I may not ever actually get to the amble, but many things to discuss. Scarcity, abundance. Scarcity, abundance. Lots and lots of paradoxes. So if I look around me at the moment and I think about one of the issues which kind of defines our age and defines our current economy, in the digital sphere and communications, there's certainly no scarcity there. There's a superabundance, an overabundance, a deluge which is almost impossible to manage. I'm a recent recruit to the Twitter sphere. I was told I had to do it when I went into Sky TV studios to comment on the comprehensive spending review. It said, you can only come if you set up a Twitter account. I did, and it leaves you in this strange world where today, profiling gone mad, Twitter suggested this morning that I should follow BMW, Socialist Worker, and Wayne Rooney. What the fuck? Culture. There's no scarcity when it comes to questions of culture. The single example I'll give to make that point is, did anybody see the documentary about the making of Primal Scream's classic album, Screamadelica? This is a brilliant moment. To cut a long story short, if you don't know the album, it's basically all about drugs. It's a great album. There was a documentary in which they spoke to this kind of poor hapless sound engineer. He was reflecting wistfully and ruefully on his time during the making of the album. And he told the time when they were on tour in Australia. And he said, yeah, that was that morning when they found me looking for the steering wheel for the Sydney Opera House to drive it to Atlantis. Culture can throw up any imaginable combination potentialities in the imagination. It's not a problem there. And yet, one of the great paradoxes that in the context of some of this sort of superabundance, we have a hideous scarcity emerging, scarcities in terms of diversity, sense of place and authenticity. The homogenization of the high street. One of the other things that Neff works on is the way in which the resilience of our economies gets hollowed out through the over-concentration of power in marketplace after marketplace, most visibly on the high street with the triumph of the supermarkets. And again, this is not necessarily anything new. G.K. Chesterton said years ago that he looked forward at the big stores that were emerging back in the 1920s and said there was nothing in front but a flat wilderness of standardization, either by Bolshevism or big business. It's pretty good, isn't it? It's damn good. Chesterton's, he's an interesting one. But then along comes economics, and obviously the whole of mainstream economics, as Dougal pointed out, is functions around this notion of scarcity. And economics is very good at sort of setting the rules in such a way. This is kind of mainstream economics, is general equilibrium theory, neoclassical economics, neoliberal economics, in such a way that whatever happens, it kind of wins. And because you have to do such things, I did look out one of the definitions from one of my several dictionaries of economics. And yes, you've heard it, you know it, you've been thinking about scarcity for a long time. Scarcity is a situation in which the needs and wants of an individual or group of individuals. Notice how economics cannot imagine society or community, only groups of individuals, exceed the resources available to satisfy. And of course, in that, you've got a lawyer's paradise of things that you can argue over the precise meaning of. Well, obviously, where wants are concerned, they can be sort of infinite and variable. And what is satisfaction? It's a trick question. Scarcity under these circumstances becomes guaranteed. The system needs it, and it very conveniently keeps you chained to the economic treadmill. There's other ways in which economics likes to rig the rules. I read a little thing about peak oil. Very good test case for this, for the study of scarcity as opposed to abundance and what it implies for the reorganization of the economy and society. And a throwaway line in this article that I've written was, if you look at the range of estimates, the point at which demand exceeds supply is either, we've either just passed it, or it is, we are living through it, or it is imminent. And some clever dick right-wing economic blogger came back with, aha, Mr. Simms, you know nothing about economics, because if you'd ever seen a graph of supply and demand, you'll notice that one cannot exceed the other. They always equal. He'd forgotten, or rather conveniently left out of the equation, the concept of unmet demand. So even under the language of conventional economics, you really can't have a problem. There can be, ultimately, no real scarcity because supply will always meet demand. And the degree to which this is central, this is hardwired into economics, is betrayed in this lovely sentence from the same dictionary of economics, in which they said, reflecting on the unimaginable absence of scarcity, in the absence of scarcity, no difficult choice would need to be made. No prices would need to be attached to anything. And this is the crucial bit. The study of economics would be rendered entirely unnecessary. Wouldn't that be awful? And how strange that civilization existed without it for millennia until about 250 years ago. However, slightly glib, because through what we know now, through the hard sciences, the earth sciences, there are real scarcities in which aggregate pressure from human consumption on the regenerative capacity of ecosystems and the availability of that capacity in the biosphere is being pushed beyond the point at which systems can regenerate. And then, of course, there's artificial scarcity created by bad distribution and confected wants. And we do have both. I believe, though, that through the kind of issues that Dougal was talking about, And through re-understanding what should be perhaps the prime focus, where we put our effort in thinking about how to support the real economy, the core economy of people and human relationships and society, intrinsic reason why we should experience debilitating scarcity in these fundamental factors that make up our lives. And just in the last few days, I mean, these are sort of fairly regular occurrences, but you'll have a new report coming out. There was one out just today, actually, from the IPCC, another major study saying renewable energy could provide all of our energy needs. There's another report out about how small-scale organic farming in India can radically improve yields and economic benefits to small farmers, and yet all the incentives push the other way, concentrating power and resources in such a way that artificial scarcities are created, as they have been done over centuries through the imposition of free market systems, whether it was under the British Empire in India and China or whatever, the creation of scarcities. I mean, I think what we do live through at the moment is an age of diminishing returns through the way that we've designed the system. And as an interesting reflection on previous civilizations that have believed they were there forever and then have ended up going the way of all things, one of the characteristics that you see, and you see this, I mean, the work of Jared Diamond and lots of other sort of archaeoanthropologists who've looked at the relationship between ecosystems and the vitality, duration, resilience of civilizations, is that one of the great characteristics of things going a bit pear-shaped is when you get diminishing returns, and that's something that we're living through at the moment. And these are very real. One very good piece of work, an ongoing piece of work, part based at the University of East Anglia, looking at 9 planetary boundaries, key ecosystems upon which the resilience of our societies depend. They identified 9, 3 of which they concluded we've already transgressed. This relates to the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and biodiversity. 3 more, we're sort of bang up against the threshold. 1 not far off, and 2, there's still a few methodological problems about how we deal with that. Oil dependence, this is one that we're very, very familiar with. You no longer have to listen to just the Friends of the Earth and the Greenpeace of this world. You can listen to people like the insurers, Lloyd's, telling us that by the end of 2013, we could be seeing oil at $200 a barrel, which is a very physical rupture in terms of our infrastructural dependence upon cheap oil. You can look at soil loss. It's another key one. Water security. Barely a week goes past without another global overview emerging in which we're up against the buffers. But why are we up against the buffers? Because the systems we've created have been characterized by, on the one hand, overall expansion. So there is, at the aggregate level, the appearance of a much richer, more superabundant world, but one in which there's been immense divergence between rich and poor, the artificial creation of material scarcity and the deprivation of key needs and wants. But at the same time, even in the winning camp, if you want to think of it like that way, and I don't generally, in a country like the UK, we've hollowed out our systems by depending upon this vulnerable global system to the point whereby the geopolitics of food security is coming to closely resemble the geopolitics of energy security, such that all it takes is a major grain producer like a Russia to decide with stressed climate systems and weak harvest that it doesn't want to export. One severe extreme weather event in Australia, and suddenly food prices go through the roof, dumping tens, hundreds of millions of people, additional people, into poverty. And you have a country like the UK, in which our own ability to feed ourselves is at a 39-year low, and our energy dependence is heading rapidly in the wrong direction. And one of the key questions that Dougal raised, and the background assumption, the degree to which a continuation, even a modified continuation of business as usual is premised upon continuing orthodox GDP growth, well, yes, absolutely, it is. Fundamentally, 100%. There is not a government, with the possible exception of Bhutan, there is not a government running a country on planet Earth that is not designing its system upon the expectation of continued GDP growth, for which it takes non-economists to get it. It takes people like Professor Roderick Smith from the Royal Academy of Engineering at Imperial College, who made a little observation, which 200 years worth, I'm slightly exaggerating, there's a couple of notable exceptions, but generally an entire economics profession has failed to observe that with a 3% growth rate, something we might have expected before the recession at least, typical, or once typical, the rate of a developed economy, it leads to a doubling of your economy in just over 23 years. If you've got a 10% rate, which you might get in some developing countries, you get a doubling in just under 7 years. What happens with every doubling? With every doubling in the economy, you use as many resources as were used in all the previous doublings combined, creating inevitable material resource scarcity. Now, the attraction, obviously, the modified business as usual approach is to think that we can deal with problems of scarcity through greater efficiency, to which one of my favourite rejoinders is Herman Daly's, I suppose I should call him an ecological economist rather than an environmental economist, who observed the notion that we can save the growth forever paradigm by dematerializing the economy or decoupling it from resources or substituting information for resources is fantasy. And then he finishes saying we can surely eat lower down the food chain, but we cannot eat recipes. It's a well-known observation. There's a thing called the Jevons paradox, the way in which the so-called rebound effect, that by improving efficiency, perversely you lower costs and free up additional potential spending, which increases overall consumption. And I apologize if you've heard this before, but I'm just going to give you this little quote as well, just to say that, damn it, we've been here before. An economist called E.J. Meachin in 1967 wrote a book called The Costs of Economic Growth. And he was very criticized then as anybody who really, I mean, you cannot be in mainstream economics and fundamentally critique or question orthodox economic growth still today. And so unsurprisingly, he was heavily criticized back then. People said to him, what about the cost of not growing? What about the poor people who need economic growth? And this was the point at which they thought they'd always got him. They said, what about the fact that raw materials haven't actually run out yet? What do you say to that? To which he replied, a man who falls from a 100-story building will survive the first 99 stories unscathed. And were he as sanguine as our technocrats, his confidence would grow with the number of stories he passed on his downward flight, and would be at a maximum just before his freefall abruptly halted. And the reason that growth also fails when it comes to issues of tackling poverty is that we have this perverse situation at the moment where, because of the income stretch and how it's increased in the global economy, you have the paradoxical situation that to get ever smaller amounts of poverty reduction at the bottom of the global income pile, it requires ever more overconsumption by the already rich and over-consuming. We did a small exercise looking at the resource intensities of the global economy, combining it with the income stretch, using the ecological footprint, and posed a question. We said, what would it actually take to get the whole world onto a minimum of $3 a day? Why $3 a day? Well, because between $3 and $4 a day, you start to break down the very hardwired link between life expectancy and income. So we said, well, let's take $3 a day as a kind of a reasonable absolute poverty level, even though the World Bank in the past has ridiculously used $1 a day. And the resource intensity required because of this income stretch means that you would need the biocapacity, the resource base of the equivalent of something like 15 planets like Earth to deliver that. So we have a problem. I did a debate with a guy from one of those sort of, what should we say, conservative-leaning economic think tanks at the Science Museum about 18 months ago. And the question of growth and scarcity of material resources came up then. And I was a bit exasperated at that point, because sometimes it's very hard to have these debates with people who are kind of quite sort of one track. And I said, ultimately, you know, when push comes to shove, where is the stuff going to come from in this kind of infinitely growing economy? And he missed about half a beat. And he said, asteroids? That was the level of the debate. How are we doing for time? How long have I been talking for? Going on and on and on. What does that say? 5 minutes. 4 minutes and counting. All right. So we have an issue. And touching on the sort of the behavioral and the psychological stuff that Dougal was talking about, if we are going to have this sort of like reboot into a world of, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Ivan Illich as well, a world in which we recognize the core economy, we understand that it underpins things, we ask how do we effectively support it. If we have the kind of economy that Herman Daly described, I mean, he was sort of thinking ahead of he talked about the kind of economy we need being the new economy being a subtle and complex economics of maintenance, qualitative improvements, sharing, frugality, and adaptation to natural limits, an economics of better, not bigger, a more convivial world. Then we have to address the issue of making transition. We need to learn the art of transition. And if the data that is coming through from the earth sciences, the hard sciences, remotely correct, and a little bit of our own number crunching, one of our own little initiatives, this 100 months campaign that we ran, suggests to us that we start playing climate roulette, i.e. the chances become worse rather than better, that we hold below a temperature rise globally at which you don't start triggering these environmental dominoes, the wonderfully euphemistically called positive feedbacks, which in this regard are not remotely positive. We reckon, making some very optimistic and conservative assumptions, that we now have about 67 months before the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere commits us to going beyond that critical temperature rise of 2 degrees. And many people have already argued that even 2 degrees is too much. So we've got a very small amount of time to play with. And we have to achieve a kind of transition in attitude and in outlook, which means taking on dominant cultures. And I thought I'd just kind of finish with this one little example, because I did it to try and make myself aware of the degree to which I, too, was being sort of subtly influenced by everything about me. And it relates to how hard it is to break TV. Okay, because we've got infrastructure lock-in through high-energy systems. We've got economic lock-in through perverse subsidies, perverse incentives, bad pricing mechanisms that don't work at the same time frame as the environment. But we have this kind of cultural lock-in through the paint pot of the culture that we live within. So I did a little test. I took one day, and this speaks to issues around how behaviour is triggered by social norms and cultural norms. What they call in the trade stereotype activation. And similar but different example to the one that Dougal gave, one classic study took 2 groups of people. One group was subtly primed with words connoting the stereotype of being elderly. The other group was the control group. Subsequent to the exercise, the 2 groups were studied. The group that had been subtly and unknowingly primed with the stereotype of being elderly actually started moving more slowly, actually experienced relative memory loss. So the cultural sort of paint pot in which you live is a profound one. So I did a little exercise. I took 24 hours and I counted every advert that I saw, magazine, newspaper, on TV, on a billboard. Everything that was telling me to define myself, first and foremost, as someone who will be most realized as a human being by buying stuff, by being, first and foremost, a consumer. This wasn't terribly scientific. It was one person in one day. And as my control, I thought I would also look out for images in the public domain, messages in the public domain, which reminded me that I was a member of society, that I had some kind of obligations as a citizen to recognize my fellow human beings. Now, the scores on the doors at the end of the day, to use an old British cultural reference to a television programme, were adverts, 454, public citizen messages, 3. So few, I could remember what each one was. One was on a railway station asking me to please not beat up the staff. One was walking along the side of the road. It was addressing me as a motorist. I'm not a motorist, but I was very pleased with the message because it said, drivers, please don't kill cyclists. And the third one was a police sign for a mugging. And I thought, hey, I kind of allowed, this was a kind of a weekday, and I allowed for the fact that at the weekend I'd probably read more papers, I'd probably watch a little bit more TV. And I reckoned that by the end of the year, in a given year, I would have been exposed to 180,000 adverts and about 1,000 public citizen messages. So a bias, a cultural bias, loading the dice of our stereotype activation as people who define ourselves first and foremost as consumers as against real, living human beings taking part in a convivial society, 180 to 1. Difficult. Big problem. So that is one of the sites where I think our struggle around understanding and renegotiating issues of scarcity and abundance, because I think we are surrounded, paradoxically, of course, by both. And it is through re-understanding and redesigning the economic model that we can get a lot of the way from here to there. Only time to just mention very briefly in passing the fact that at the heart of our great transition model is lowering costs to the economy. It leads to an economy in which GDP shrinks. The way that we compensate and hold the social contract together is because we lower environmental costs on the one hand, but we move to a model in which there's far higher levels of equality in society. For our exercise, we took the levels of equality that you would find in Denmark. So very different to the UK, but not unimaginable. And in this different model, through lowering a wide range of social costs, because as Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett point out, in more equal societies, almost everything works better and your costs are far lower. You start to lay the foundations for that more convivial world that we would like to imagine. And the final thought is there have been occasions when we've been through such abrupt ruptures and re-engineerings, both of society and the economy and our whole systems of production, very specific, very historically and culturally specific. But during wartime, we saw the kind of re-engineering, the kind of rise in equality, actually, of the nature and the scale, but not the detail, that I think is asked of us through the critical excess pressures we're putting on the biosphere today. And there were surprising, unintendedly positive outcomes. The life expectancy and the health of the nation improved dramatically. There's a lot of more anecdotal stuff about how social capital grew, social capital formation accelerated during that period. There's another interesting, very compressed case study around Cuba in the early 90s when it lost access to cheap Soviet oil. The proliferation of organic agriculture, the radical improvement in the health of the nation, built admittedly on a lot of prior redistribution and a very high quality education and health system. So there are things both scarce and abundant all around us. The one thing I'm absolutely convinced of, and share Dougal's thoughts, is that we must brace ourselves and prepare ourselves for change. And if we want to be in the driving seat rather than buffeted by exogenous shocks economic, environmental, geopolitical. We need to start focusing not just on going through a process of transition, but how we can do it very quickly. And my last thought about how we might go about doing that, especially as we're in a university, is, ironically, as the great Scandinavian, Swedish writer Sven Lindqvist writes, is that I don't think that it's knowledge we lack. I think we already know enough. I think you do. I think we've probably got some pretty good ideas of where we need to start. What's been lacking so far is the courage to understand what we know and to act. Thank you for listening.